Come on, Luke muttered impatiently. It should have been here by now. His heart had been in unrest for a while, waiting for it to arrive. A few moments had passed, and in the corner of his right eye, he saw a familiar glint. It energetically circled overhead, all the while flaunted its hues of blood orange and dandelion accents that dotted its wings. After its little performance, it perched right on Luke's left shoulder and bowed its head before him. Luke then closed his eyes and focused. He took a deep breath and concentrated. A subtle hum reverberated around the round, avian creature and himself. As soon as he felt a sharp clarity in his mind, he received the message he had been waiting for. Words flooded his head that slowly shaped into proper sentences. Hey Luke, I know it's been a while, but I'll be around the west side of town this evening, where we used to hang during first year. It'd be nice to see you again after all this time under curfew. The words eventually fizzled and dissolved in the darkness of his thoughts. After synthesizing the message in his head, Luke slowly regained his senses and focused on the present. He glanced at the avian creature on his left shoulder, still in a deep trance, with its eyes shut. It wasn't long before it awoke, and Luke had already had his fill, gazing at the embers spurting out of its body and wings. It stared at Luke with a flat but perky smile, much like its owner before flying back to the direction it came from. Memories of their time spent together began to flood Luke's mind. In particular, he looked back when the two of them first met. His friend had a shaggy cut and bore a cheeky frame of a wispy mustache and goatee. Not like Luke was one to be judgmental, but the look made him stare in a perturbed manner. Although, it was thanks to his friend that he managed to familiarize himself with other apprentices like him in their batch. Almost every day, they would bump into each other when he fancied exploring the town, at least when he was still new in the area. Since then, they became inseparable, as close as brothers, others would say. Luke sighed at the thoughts of those old memories. He rubbed his eyes and bitterly sipped his cooled brew. Disappointing, like how their friendship has trended of late. Who sends their familiar after no reciprocation to my replies for months and expects the mood would be the same? Luke pondered to himself in a silent fit. He wouldn't notice at the moment, but his friends would point out that his brows furrowed. But at the same time, he could not deny how much he yearned for his best friend. He had always been there with him when he was unfamiliar with the town and shared too many warm memories to count. Luke still blamed himself for not having a proper goodbye when the curfew started. No one could have predicted it. It would have happened either way. He couldn't help but feel guilty for some unresolved arguments they had. These were the moments when they were able to overcome shaky moments in their friendship. Since then, it was part of the things that had been eating him up inside. Luke realized this was an opportunity that he could not avoid this time. He knew that he would never get another chance like it again. With the world ending, what did he even have to lose? He chugged the remaining contents in his mug and briskly walked back in his lodgings to prepare for his meetup. All that he could find while he rummaged in his storage chest were his last pair of supply run gear, a pair of gloves dotted with holes and exposed padding wrapped around his hands, goggles that were smudged by months of use, and clothing that has aged. He was supposed to use this last fit for his next supply run, but Luke thought it could still hold its own for this hopefully short reunion. He did not want to linger too long when there was a threat out there that is still a mystery to most folks. It was roughly 5 years ago since then, and Luke took it to himself to train well under the possibly only laudable scholar in his town, a mage of the communion. Parents with gifted children made it their life's goal to have them under the wing of the man who saved the townsfolk from a disaster. Now that he had become an apprentice, there was a certain reputation that he had to uphold. After all, this mage managed to set up a barrier that protected the entire town and drove back ascending class creatures from wreaking havoc. As he scanned his map, the walk toward the area had a pylon refuge that was recently installed for local and foreign merchants, moving along the road that connected to town. The meetup point was just a little further north, covered by forest and thick foliage. Back when the town was still bustling, Luke would sheepishly wave at passerby who recognized him. He was not much of a loud speaker, but he was well recognized for his magnetic charm. Not because of his talents, but because of the way he listens to the stories of others and pays attention to their details. It's also the reason why a lot of people depend on him, since he manages to get the job done to the best of his abilities. Now that the warmth was extinguished, or swallowed rather, by the ongoing calamity at hand, Luke couldn't help but yearn for it. Just as he had begun to become at home with the townsfolk and the peaceful countryside views, it was all taken away from him. No, not just him, from all of them, from all of the people in hiding, in fear of becoming consumed by it. The path transitioned from familiar cream roads to pointed hostile foliage. The trees did not seem as uninviting when Luke had entered. It was as if the forest, too, was plagued by something sinister. The leaves and ferns around him wafted an unpleasant and pungent odor, like he had stayed in a hut colonized by decaying mushrooms. The forest was even quieter than usual. Not a critter in sight, and the birds have stopped harmonizing. Just like visiting the cemetery in town, Luke sadly said. After wading through the sea of jade decay, Luke finally arrived at the meeting spot. He turned his head to his left and right, squinted his eyes to look further. No one in sight. Was he early? He looked at the lifeless clearing, all stiff and crooked, dead as a grave. He called out his friend's name, only for it to be replied back by the subtle sway of dead leaves. The message did tell him that his friend would have been the first to arrive. His chest rose, then promptly exhaled to relieve himself of pressure. Tutting in disappointment, he decided to inspect his surroundings. Oddly enough, there was something familiar about the boulder in the clearing. He caressed it with his fingers and swept some dust off. It was cool and relaxing against the skin. He then sat on top and placed down his rucksack, and it was then the realization hit him. Of course, this was our secret base. His memories drew from the time that Luke was snacking on fresh berries while his friend recounted the girls he tried to court. Luke was not much of a romantic, but he did enjoy understanding the dynamics of how relationships functioned. His friend, in particular, was someone he labeled as hopeless, to which most of the townsfolk agreed with when Luke would passively eavesdrop. It was upsetting to see a once lush and emerald clearing to be reduced to withered husks and pale shades of brown. It may have been just a simple place to gather, but it did hold a lot of memories for Luke. The first time that his friend gallantly proclaimed that the empty clearing would be the mark of greatness in their journeys. The times they successfully escaped trouble and lost their pursuers. The quiet moments where they were deep in their studies, concentrating before an exam. There were too many to count. Most of all were the heart-to-heart talks they both shared. Luke treasured having a close friend he could be vulnerable with. But the situation had changed. He stood up and backed away from the boulder and scanned his surroundings intently. Things were taking too long. Just as Luke was about to send his own familiar out to send his friend a message, he heard the rustling of grass somewhere nearby. He promptly charged up his vambrace and took up a defensive stance. He wore his goggles and adjusted it by weaving an enchantment to its lenses. His ears were perked, and his eyes scanned his front view intently. This way, he'd be able to detect the presence of anomalies easier. But as luck would have it, a large and formidable force suddenly came up to his view, causing him to fall over and drop his goggles. He scurried backward. A large brown creature stomped on the only pair of goggles in his inventory. The brutish beast squealed in aggression and swayed its tusks to intimidate him. Luke could not have detected this creature, even if it snuck on him, for it was known to be a really formidable ambush predator. And even if he had prepared even earlier, this creature was organic. Foaming out of its jaw was a sickly green nest of bubbles and slime. It breathed heavily and was digging away earth, preparing to charge at him. Instinctively, Luke grasped at one of his pouches tied to his belt and flung it towards the beast. Quickly! He faced his right palm toward it and verbalized the short incantation infused with his essence. The small darting pouch responded in a faint glow. A thick and large cloud of smoke covered the entire clearing. Luke stumbled as he tried to get up, but continued his struggle of clawing away from the creature. He could hear it thrashing within the thick smoke, and felt the earth pound from its weight and power. There was no moment to lose and escape while it was in a daze. He got up this time and managed to scurry away. His throat was still dry with how close he launched the pouch. Despite that, his legs still propelled him forward. At that moment, he saw a familiar shape zooming in the sky. It was his friend's familiar. It landed right on his forehead, synchronizing with a very disturbed Luke. "Hey Luke, I hope this message reaches you on time. But I had to move on early and help out my mom gather my last belongings in town. Sorry for the change of plans, but I look forward to seeing you again soon. Let's plan once we finish our current task in class. See ya, brother." Once the message had been planted in Luke's head, the avian figure darted quickly out of sight, as if to avoid getting left behind its master. Luke was in such a sorrier state than when he entered the forest. His clothes were covered in black soot, and his forehead was marked with the absence of where his goggles were supposed to be. To make matters worse, he left his rucksack by the boulder. The sight of dirt roads was enough to instinctively make his knees drop. Luke lay on his back and tried to catch his breath. His chest rose and fell in a continuous rhythm, while his mouth was open and parched. Luke remained silent. His breathing paused for a moment, and heat began to rush on the surface of his skin. He felt tension stiffen his muscles, and he did not notice his fingers had curled to form fists on both his hands. His face began to moisten before a few trickled tears drew out of the corner of his eyes. "That was it?" he questioned. "That was what I risked my own life for?" His voice louder when he asked that. He sat up and rubbed off the stream of tears in his eyes. His body was still in shock, so he was slow and jittery with his movements. He hugged his thighs, still sniffling and snobbing alone, out in the deserted roads. This was not the first time this had happened. Luke remembered this cycle all too well. During the first times, he shrugged it off, or thought nothing of it, because he was too charmed by his friend's niceness. It felt wrong that someone who spent a lot of time with him would be questioned for not being accountable and considerate. So he did not call out his friend for treating him that way whenever they got in trouble. He just thought that it was part of the culture of the townsfolk. Today's events proved to Luke that he was not as important as he thought he was. It took him a while to realize on the ground that all the feelings he harbored were his own, but never really had the difficult conversation to confront his friend and question his repetitive behavior. To put more salt in the wound, his last and battered equipment gear was all over the wilderness. All that was left with Luke were the surviving clothes and pads to keep him guarded. Luke lay flat on the ground again and sat with the boiling disappointment and frustrations that manifested in him. His muscles were tenser than earlier when he was fleeing for his life. As his recent thoughts continued on, his teeth began to clench tight and ever slightly grind side to side. His eyes still watered, but not pouring out any more tears. They were being maintained by the rising heat from his anger that only a few would pour out. Never again, he thought to himself. He had enough wasting his time investing over a dead cause. Now, he had to think of his survival more than ever. He slowly got up to his feet, and without looking back, he trudged back home. The distant squeals and wails had already stopped, and the forest returned to its eerie silence. Back in his cabin, Luke found the orange familiar as he arrived, still seemingly lost, returning to its master. It struggled to pick up the navigation traces it left, and must have confused its old routes. Luke slowly walked towards the creature and held it in his right palm. He closed his eyes and bound it using his own power. The avian familiar chirped frantically in the struggle, but Luke did not loosen his grip. He closed his eyes and concentrated faster than earlier in the morning. He immediately was able to synchronize with it and began to drain a frequency from it. The bird's eyes glowed a pale azure, and the orange in its body began to fade, leaving it grayer and lifeless looking. Luke made sure to be delicate and managed to find what he was looking for. Once he did, he returned the familiar's essence back, and the orange and radiating hue began to flow back into it. A heavy sigh was heard as that happened. The familiar stopped struggling and turned to Luke, looking perplexed, as if it did not recognize him. He then loosened his grip and gently raised his hands toward the sky, allowing the orange little wall to take flight, and soon was lost in sight. Luke looked over toward the horizon and saw a pink and lilac sky. At the top, gray clouds brewed, signaling that he had to bring in his clothes for the night. While towards the center, he saw the last rays of light for the day shrink until it could not be seen anymore.